Alrighty, guys, so welcome to lecture one. And today is kind of a lecture of setting the scene, right? We're starting way at the beginning with prehistoric architecture that isn't even recorded in texts and literature, architecture that's really only discovered by excavations or else by looking at modern examples that kind of continue these forms of vernacular and religious historic architecture today in the more tribal regions of the earth. So we're going to be looking at cave paintings, some of the earliest cities. We're going to be looking at the earliest religious structures like megaliths. We're going to be looking at things like Stonehenge, but we're also going to be looking at, as I said, a lot of modern examples of what would have been prehistoric architecture, but but examples that survive today of building methods which we have evidence for use in the prehistoric period. So the prehistoric period really ends around 3000 BC, 4000 BC, when humans began writing about themselves, and this is why it's called the prehistoric period. We don't have history, we don't have any documentation of wars and battles and kings and queens, political movements, artistic movements. We really only have archaeology. We really only have surveying to understand the architecture of this time. So this is kind of going to be, as I said, a preliminary lecture to set up the scene. It might be a little bit of a shorter class than the others, but it is no less important. So do be sure you're taking notes during all of this. So let's go back to the very beginning with the oldest known building, Terra Mata, found in southern France. And this building, believe it or not, was not even, we think, built by humans. The earliest known building on Earth was, in fact, we think, built by Neanderthals because of, the prevalence of Neanderthal skulls on the site. But the emergence of the human species dates back to around 6 or 7 million years ago. And our common ancestor with Neanderthals was Homo erectus, the very species that we think invented fire, we think discovered fire, and therefore had a major advantage over all other species. We can identify their stone tools, their hearths. So it's very clear that fire came from Homo erectus and then spread to their evolutions, both to Neanderthals and to Homo sapiens, to humans in Africa, to Neanderthals living kind of around the Mediterranean and in Europe, spread to Denisovans in Asia, another kind of offshoot of Homo erectus. But Homo erectus is where all of these kind of humanoid species come from. And most of these species evolving from Homo erectus seem to have lived in caves, kind of driving, predator animals from caves, driving bears from caves, lions from caves, and kind of occupying them, cooking their food inside in the mouths of the caves, using them as shelters from the elements, and using them as hideaways to follow their herds around the planet, right? These hunter-gatherers, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, Denisovans, would have followed herds around regions of the world as they migrated, not domesticated herds, wild herds, but kind of picking off the young, the old, for their own food, but being sure to conserve their numbers as they moved around the planet and followed them and found caves to stay in, right? This is kind of, going on for millions of years of Homo sapien, Neanderthal, and Denisovan history. But we think now around 400,000 BC, Neanderthal hunter-gatherers began to construct and build huts in the open rather than staying in caves in some cases. So this camp here at Terra Mata is the first concrete example of this, discovered near Nice in southern France in 1966. And it seems it served many, many, many generations of Neanderthal hunter-gatherers who visited it during a few months every year in the late spring. So archaeologists here have kind of identified traces of almost 20 oval huts, fitted very closely together in this cove by the beach. And it seems bands of about 15 Neanderthals built and kind of occupied the huts for these very limited hunting forays, while their herds that they followed around France, were staying in this region of France, and then sort of leaving these huts to collapse after their herd had moved on and they went to follow them, right? So essentially, these Neanderthal builders really built these huts in kind of the most simple way you can build huts, by setting rows of branches close together within a ring of stones, right? We can see evidence of this in the archaeological layers. And then we think they would have pitched the tops together, creating this kind of vault-like covering over two large posts that ran down the center to help support the roof. So these are buildings you kind of have to squat down to get into, but they offer shelter from the elements. They offer shade, right? They create a sense of community. They essentially bring the cave out into the open for the first time. And so each year, as these seasonal Neanderthal hunters returned to this site, it seems they set up new huts over the old ones or nearby to them after they had returned and found an empty site once again, but they would return to the same exact region year after year, generation after generation, because this is where they heard, maybe they were following deer, habitually migrated to every single year. So the series of huts at Terra Amata kind of spread around the world after this time period, and kind of underwent very subtle changes over millennia according to availability of materials. So some of the first Stone Age huts actually built by humans were these very spectacular huts found in Ukraine, the Mesolrich bone huts, built actually from the bones of great mammoths and other prey animals, built near Kiev in Ukraine, again probably by humans. These are essentially built in a very similar way to the huts at Terra Amata, but raised instead on the skeletal remains of hunters' prey. It's thought that each single hut was composed of up to 150 bones, including 36 sets of mammoth tusks that kind of framed the doorway and held the roof, and over the bones were draped, it's thought, the hides of these humans' prey animals. But as you can imagine, in the Ukraine during the last ice age, these were built, so there wasn't a lot of trees, there wasn't a lot of flora to build huts out of, but these huts, allowed humans to migrate more meticulously with their herd animals, with their prey. So, rather than having to find a cave nearby where their herds migrated, they could simply pack up their huts and move on, and then rebuild them in new places wherever their herd happened to go. But caves were still, during much of the prehistoric period, for much of the world, dedicated to ritual and death commemoration, especially the inner recesses of a cave. So, while at its mouth a group of Neanderthals or Homo sapiens might make a simple dwelling, within its inner recesses, which could be as big as, a cathedral, they dedicated to making cave paintings to honor ritual and death commemoration. The first and earliest evidence we have of a religious ritual also comes from Neanderthals. Around 70,000 BC, we see Neanderthal cave dwellers near Rome place a Neanderthal skull in a trench within a cave with stones arranged around it, probably indicating an early religious ritual, definitely indicating an honoring of the dead, a view that the dead somehow was still perceiving them, somehow was still alive in some way, and needed to be honored. But Neanderthals began to die out around 40,000 BC and were gradually replaced by humans around the Mediterranean and in Europe as they migrated out of Africa. Humans had a much smaller stature but much larger brains, and so they improved massively upon the stone tools, the art, and the rituals seen being used by Neanderthals. And as far as we can tell, humans much more carefully buried their dead than Neanderthals because they left markers. But the most significant things early humans did was lay the foundations for religious architecture. We really don't have evidence for religious architecture coming from anything really but humans. Neanderthals, yes, They seem to have honored their dead, but they don't seem to have had dedicated spaces for practicing religion like humans have. So humans are really the only species that, as far as we can tell, adorned caves with painting. So painted caves date mostly from the last glacial period, from around 30,000 to 12,000 years ago, and we find them all over the world in Australia, Africa, India, Mexico, and Southern Europe. They feature lots of things, but the most common things are sort of stenciled hands, abstract patterns, and depictions of the animals they hunted and were hunted by. So if you can imagine these nomadic hunters, chasing herds across the planet, brought with them art to commemorate their cults. And their cults, their religions, were based on animal vitality. They were based on the life force of the tribe, which was the herds that they followed. So essentially, they worshipped something outside of themselves for the continuation, for the health of these herds, because this was their food. This is what kept them alive. So in some caves, it's even thought that they, kind of depicted themselves as insignificant stick figures, kind of moving with the herds, coaxing them, slaying the beasts reverently, and kind of devising magic rituals to ensure their continued abundance. So we think this is at least a basic understanding of how this primitive religion around the world, this primitive hunter-gatherer religion worked. So the Shavak Cave, for example, is believed to be Europe's oldest painted cave, dating back to around 30,000 BC, and the cave was actually accessed from above and contained, all of these ritual markings and art in its inner spaces. The entrance hall was once, as we can tell, inhabited by bears and was adorned with a small mammoth, but once you get into the back of the cave, into the great religious temple center of the cave, the dimensions are kind of comparable to a cathedral, absolutely huge. We can tell that bears lived in this cave previously and kind of dug out these kind of nooks, these kind of almost apses that the humans kind of converted into side chapels. They contained every so often these kind of altar-like stones with animal skulls at the center. So obviously in some way they're worshiping these animals for probably their vitality, for their survival, because they need them to survive. They need them to hunt and subsist on. So they depicted two types of animals on these caves, predator animals and prey animals. And as far as the predator animals go, you see over 300 paintings and drawings of bears, leopards, and other competitors in hunting covering the walls. And then you see hundreds more prey animals. You see horses, you see woolly rhinos, you see bison, oxen, you see mammoths, goats, and owls. And the final chamber at the very back of the cave depicts a large woman. I couldn't find it in pictures, but you'll just have to take my word for it. It depicts a large woman, possibly representing, kind of being interpreted as the great goddess of the earth, the figure that they're worshiping, that all of these animals spring out from. They're all running out of her. So possibly this is the kind of life force that they're symbolically worshiping in this region, in this cave. So you have to kind of imagine all this amazing artwork as kind of almost like graffiti, with all of these ongoing projects added by successive generations of hunters over centuries. It's very clear that this wasn't all done in one go, but this was rather, kind of a holy site added to and revered for centuries, a holy site for worshiping the vitality of the herds. And I just think this is such a perfect example to lead into a study of human architecture, because it's such a human thing to do, to have this tiny, tiny dwelling area in the front and then a huge cathedral space dedicated to religion. I think it's a really nice reflection of the human mind and its tendency to kind of reach out and devote ourselves to something bigger than us. We don't, merely concern ourselves with the day-to-day, but we make life infinitely more complicated and beautiful for ourselves. But obviously we wouldn't be stuck in the Ice Age forever, and it was around 16,000 BC that the planet underwent really the last cycle of recurring ice ages with these 9-month-long winters. But after this long period of global warming followed and led to, the receding ice sheets, the receding glaciers that encouraged much of the planet to develop into forests and fertile plains where before were ice, snow, and glaciers. And so between really the 12th and the 5th centuries BC, these much longer growing seasons in the spring and summer allowed hunter-gatherers in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia to finally adopt and invent farming and settle near water and fertile soil. So this transition from some hunter-gatherers on the earth to a new mode of feeding themselves, a new mode through farming, through agriculture, led to urbanism, led to the first cities, particularly in what's called the Fertile Crescent. So this region around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, really encompassing modern day Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, where originally a lot of these wild grains, wheat and barley especially, grew in abundance. So humans figured out how to reliably farm these and kind of accumulate food surpluses, store it up in big silos to feed large fixed populations for long periods of time throughout the winter, so that tasks could be divvied up. Not everyone had to hunt, gather, or farm. And so one of the earliest of these kind of early cities we have archaeological evidence for, and by far the most famous, is Çatalhöyük, this Neolithic settlement in southwest Turkey. We think occupied from around 7400 to 6000 BC, and it was kind of this very dense fabric of rectangular houses with no streets in between, so all of the houses kind of butting up against each other for safety from probably predators, but mostly, roving bands of hunter-gatherers looking to steal their cattle, steal their goods. Because this was a very valuable site to them indeed. It was a very successful site. They essentially controlled the obsidian market in their local area. And obsidian was the single most valuable tool of the Neolithic age. It was the sharpest implement you could afford to find and the most durable. So all of these houses, as I said, are kind of butted together for safety because this is essentially a very prime and a very important market area, and they want to protect their goods. This is essentially probably a band of a city of traders trading with the kind of hunter-gatherer world. And these houses all seem to be entered from above. They seem to be entered from the roofs. They all would have had entrances only on the roof. So, in this reconstruction, you can see it's thought that, people would have climbed down ladders into the houses. And it has, things for comfortable living. It has platforms for sleeping on either sides of these small rooms. They usually have an oven or a hearth. And these big grain silos built into the walls. And the families who lived in these houses even seem to have buried their dead under the floorboards after the bones had been picked clean by buzzards. But I think the most interesting thing about these houses at Çatalhöyük is they all had shrines present along one or more walls in these houses, and religious imagery covering the walls, just like the cave paintings, and just like the cave painters, they depicted and venerated their herds on their walls, but unlike the cave painters, their herds were domesticated oxen, so we see and find a lot of ceramic oxen heads in these houses. It's thought, hanging on the wall or sitting on kind of ceremonial platforms and altars. So the theory is, just like how the cave painters were venerating their wild herds for their continued vitality, here in Çatalhöyük, this city of traders were venerating their domesticated herds for their continued vitality and abundance. Despite this, the majority of the Earth's population, around 99%, remained nomadic. Vernacular architecture, originating in prehistoric times obviously, is seen worldwide throughout its modern iterations. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about common vernacular architecture, still in use around the world, but the origins of which were conceived in the prehistoric era. Only, these buildings don't exist anymore, so we have to look at modern examples. We're going to look at a lot of houses of nomads, or just methods of building that still exist today or existed in the past and were very, very common. So, nomadic and settled communities perfected their dwellings through trial and error in the Neolithic period, from, more temporary huts to more permanent wooden, mud, or stone structures. The range of creations massively varied, a lot more than you might think. And so, vernacular architecture really played a role in reinforcing local identities. I'm sure it might seem, looking at Neolithic buildings, looking at Neolithic cave paintings, it might seem very uniform, like a kind of pan-human culture. But as architecture evolves, local identities, local materials are really intensely expressed because people are only working with what the land is giving them. And people are finally settling down into cooperative and stable societies, so they're able to live very differently and live by exploiting their local landscapes and developing local cultures. So in Central Africa, for example, some groups still maintain the hunter-gatherer lifestyle similar to ancient times. The kind of best examples are the San people in Botswana and the Baka in Cameroon. And these groups still construct these temporary huts while following herds, just like some of the groups we've been talking about. And so they favor these kind of half-dome structures of intertwined branches covered with woven grass and leaves. And actually the Baka women create these huts. They're called Mongolu huts by weaving slender branches into a thick arch, forming this sort of semi-dome. And then, these kind of smaller branches serve as ribs, while, large oval leaves of the mongogo tree create this kind of impermeable exterior to block out the elements. And the same leaves are actually used for their bedding. And so these huts are usually arranged in a circle, serving as living quarters for up to 3 months before moving on. But sadly, the Baka and San people are increasingly pushed toward permanent settlement because of political and environmental factors, because their herds are being hunted by poachers and not very well protected. But historically, hunter-gatherers, as I've said, prioritized conserving natural resources and habitats over altering them, as later settled societies would do. The Tuareg people, on the other hand, have maintained a sort of economic lifestyle by traversing the Sahara Desert back and forth as traders and shepherds for centuries, and they're a great example to look at, to imagine what the architecture, what the dwellings would have been like for the more pastoral people of, say, the Fertile Crescent in the Neolithic era. So essentially, they carry these temporary shelters kind of wrapped up, coiled up on their camels during their journeys, and then when they stop to settle and pasture their herds, they raise their tents by throwing a canopy of sewn hides and woven goat hair over a central pole topped by a supporting ring. And from the central ring, they pull ropes down in a sort of radial pattern radiating out from the central pole, fastening them to stakes arranged in a square plan. And then they insert curved branches between the ropes to kind of coax the skin into a dome-like canopy and then they pull more ropes across the outside to secure it against the wind. It's this very stable, very shady, and very inconspicuous portable home in the Sahara Desert. And then when the nomads move on, they fold the hides and bind them into a package with the stock and poles in the middle to be carried once again on the camel's back. The indigenous people of North America achieved very similar dwelling places to the Tuareg, using a minimum of materials and causing little disturbance to the land. The teepee is actually named after the Sioux word to dwell, and it actually only required a few minutes for assembly because the Sioux were always on the move, following herds across America. And so Sioux builders in the Dakota Territories, essentially to build a teepee, they stand 4 straight poles into the ground at the 4 points of a square, and then the poles converged into a kind of interlocking crux made firm by, binding the neck joint with strips of bark. And then with this basic structure in place, a dozen other poles were set in a circular pattern and leaned toward the apex, and then they drew a conical covering of stitched buffalo hides over the frame, leaving a flap on the top to let smoke out. It can be closed or open depending on the weather, and then another flap to cover the entry at the base. And the teepees actually also almost always tilted to the west to brace against the prevailing western winds of the prairies. So, like the Tuareg, the Native Americans of the plains also transported the basic ingredients of their dwellings with them as they moved across the continent, usually, carrying the buffalo hides, but finding the poles from, forests of their next dwelling place, but notably originally without horses to carry them because horses were brought over by the Europeans. Other nomadic people of North America, such as the Chippewa tribes, built these domical wigwams that served a little bit longer settlement periods. Constructed of bent poles, the wigwam required a lot more skills to prepare since the sapling branches had to kind of be trained into shape. So the arched ribs usually followed this kind of grid pattern, and the structure kind of looked like this overturned basket. And then mats of woven grasses or strips of barks or sewn hides were tucked into the ribs to keep out the elements. And an oculus, this rounded hole cut at the top, served as the smokestack. And so during seasonal migrations, right, when the herds that these nomadic peoples were following moved on, the occupants of these wigwams simply rolled up the coverings, the mats, while leaving the skeletal frames in place, actually for reuse when they returned to the site the following year. And these were kind of dependable, just these kind of skeletal frames weren't really typically destroyed by animals or the landscape, and in any case, they were very simple to construct, but they kind of marked these sites as dependable to be found again by the same community. The steppe nomads of Mongolia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan build something called a yurt still today, which is essentially a supersized, sophisticated wigwam. So here's how it works. Yurt builders start with a cylindrical base made from kind of a grid of wooden poles arranged in this crisscross pattern, and then they raise this base to about head height. Then they place dozens of slender poles on top, fanning them out in a sort of radial pattern from a central point called an oculus, which acts as a kind of compression ring, a hub holding everything together. Next, they cover this umbrella-like frame with these big pieces of felt. Felt is essentially pounded and tangled sheep or goat hair, and then they secure it all with ropes. The whole structure is supported in the center by just two slender columns, and so despite their size, yurts are very quickly to assemble and surprisingly light to carry around. And so it's pretty impressive how these nomads can kind of pack up their homes and carry them around like we do with our clothes. This flexibility allows them to live very lightly on the land, adapting to its conditions, herding their sheep or goats to find the best pastures without making big changes to the environment. Unbaked mud, on the other hand, has been a go-to material since ancient times and is still popular among some traditional builders today. It's super flexible, easy to shape, and stiffens up very nicely, but it can obviously lose its form if it gets too damp or if there's an earthquake. A bit of old wisdom says you need good boots and a nice hat to protect mud structures. This means, using stone footings and deep eaves to keep moisture at bay. But you can also add some makeup, some bitumen based or lime plaster to make the walls more impermeable to the elements. Now, when it comes to earthquakes, mud structures don't hold up well unless they're reinforced with wood frames. Take the city of Bam, for example. It was this incredible city built entirely of mud and straw, but in 2003, a massive earthquake hit eastern Iran and completely leveled Bam's domes, towers, and houses. These structures had very thick, sturdy walls to handle the force of gravity, but they just couldn't withstand the sideways shaking from the quake. So naturally, prehistoric builders found that one of the simplest and safest ways to build with earth, especially in earthquake-prone areas, is simply to dig or cut into it. So in, for example, the northwestern Shaanxi province in China, on the vast Loess Plateau, over 40 million people live in these dugout houses. So this area, roughly the entire size of Spain, has soil essentially so tightly packed by winds and glaciers that trees even have a hard time growing. And so for the past 3,000 years, the people of this area have been carving out pit houses as their homes. They start by digging a courtyard about 10 meters deep, And then they create rooms on all four sides of the courtyard dug out from the very dense earth. These rooms are essentially accessed through these kind of arched entries, and often, have these vaulted ceilings, which are a lot stronger than flat roofs, so they don't have to reinforce the roofs. The compressive strength of the very thick earth reinforces it for them if they make it into this barrel vault. But rainfall is very scarce in this region, and this is good so that these courtyards don't flood. But water retention is obviously a big challenge. So instead of having drains, these pit house courtyards collect rainwater in cisterns to make the most of what little rain they get. And so these people have lived and thrived in this very harsh region using prehistoric techniques for 3,000 years. So these forms of architecture that I'm talking about today are in no ways obsolete. They are in some cases the absolute best reaction to the landscape, best adaptation to the landscape, making these places habitable still in the modern day. While many ancient people dug pit houses out of the earth, not everyone had the right geological conditions to do so. So they came up with another clever way to build with earth. They mixed soil, water, straw, reeds, and leaves into balls that they could stack. And so, this method, known as the cob technique, was common in many, many parts of the world. So the Batmilda people in Africa are still masters of this technique. They build their walls by stacking coils of mud balls, usually in circular shapes. And, each family's walled compound kind of consists of several rounded huts of this manner. And these huts are actually not just functional, but also kind of symbolic. Their design and decoration represent the human body. The entry they call the mouth, the kitchen they call the stomach, the central hut they call the womb, and the great drain pipe out of the hut they call the phallus. And so structurally, these walls are, as you can imagine, very, very much thicker at the base, and then they taper as they go up. So the roofs of these huts are either built on branches and kind of flat and mud paved, or they built of these kind of conical bundles of straw. And of course, every year these houses need replastering, and of course every new generation participates in rebuilding them, keeping the tradition alive. So these are kind of living buildings. When it comes to earth construction, though, the two most common techniques by far are rammed earth and adobe brick. These methods require a bit more skill and planning because they're much more popular with the settled populations that can afford this kind of thing. Rammed earth, for instance, which you see an example of here, involves, using slightly moist earth that's been poured into a wooden mold and then pounded down layer by layer with a heavy hammer. So one of the most stunning examples of rammed earth construction can be found in the grand cylinders and cubes built by the Hakka people in the Fujian province in China. So here in the village of Chuxi, there are these 5 fortress-like compounds known as tulu, which were built during the 15th century. And these tulu are absolutely massive and incredible. They're essentially cities. They can house up to 200 rooms, all kind of clinging to wooden scaffolds attached to the solid mud perimeter walls. So the inhabitants kind of live in concentric rows of structures around these large defensive open courtyards. And so for their mud walls, the Hakka builders essentially use clay-rich soil mixed with straw, and a special mixture that includes brown sugar, egg whites, and sticky rice juice to help bind everything together. And they swear by this mixture, and obviously it's very successful, right? These buildings have lasted hundreds of years. So the outer walls are, as you can imagine, impressively thick. They're actually 3 meters thick at the base, and then they taper to 1 meter thick at the top, and they usually rise up to 4 stories high. And so these walls are, remember, good footings and a good set on stone foundations to protect against humidity, and also have these very wide eaves, these very wide roofs to help against rain. And so the defensive nature of these Tulu kind of castles is very evident from the absence of, you see no exterior windows on the first 2 levels. There's only a single entry point into these drum-shaped compounds, making it very, very easy to monitor who comes and who goes. And we have tons of archaeological evidence for rammed earth construction all around the prehistoric and ancient world, but this is just a great modern example to look at, or should I say 15th century example. But unbaked adobe bricks absolutely take the cake as the most common medium of architecture in the prehistoric world. So how do they make these bricks? So essentially builders cast an earth mixture, usually of mud, sand, and straw, into rectangular molds, into rectangular bars, often, using wooden molds to standardize the shape of the bricks, just like normal bricks. And then the bricks are, instead of being fired, which is very expensive at this time, which is very expensive in the prehistoric world, it requires a lot of cooperation and a lot of fuel. The bricks are just simply dried and hardened in the sun, and then, just like regular bricks, they're laid in regular courses and stuck together with mortar made from the same material, so usually mud, sand, and straw. And this technique has very ancient roots. The hand-molded mud bricks of Neolithic Jericho are some of the earliest examples we know of. And I know I've included a picture of Bronze Age Jericho, which is way, way later, but I couldn't find a picture of Neolithic Jericho, so I have to settle with Bronze Age Jericho. But just know, Bronze Age Jericho would have probably also been built with mostly unbaked mud bricks. Now I think let's just jump to Yemen just so you can see a real world example. So, the mud brick tower houses here that still survive today are truly impressive and come from this kind of centuries old tradition that dates back at least to the 12th century AD. And so some of these towers reach over 30 meters high and are built of exclusively wooden scaffolding and mud brick. And so the builders of these tower houses use this mud thickened kind of white gypsum plaster to shape and frame the windows and the doors. And so, once set, this material can kind of be carved into intricate patterns, adding, both strength and beauty to the structures. So you can imagine, mud brick is very moldable, and it kind of asks to be carved, asks to be inspired with a lot of art. So you can maybe imagine a lot of these unbaked mud brick houses and structures in the prehistoric world perhaps being decorated as extravagantly as these mud brick towers in Yemen, although they don't show it on a lot of reconstructions today. In the great forests of northern Neolithic Europe, Neolithic humans in this region typically lived in houses made entirely of sticks and logs because this was the prevalent building material. These people were kind of carving out the great forests of northern Europe, a lot of pine forests. And so evidence for these wooden log houses, just like you see in this reconstruction, dates all the way back to the 5000s and 4000s BC at the earliest, and these kinds of houses have been found all the way from the Black Sea to the British Isles, so the entirety of northern Europe essentially. And these longhouses were essentially built using these regularly spaced large timber posts set in parallel rows with, roof beams bracing them at the top. And then they would weave essentially tree branches around the exterior posts to create this kind of basket-like structure called wattle, which was then, plastered with mud balls called daub to form the walls, to form, an impermeable wall. And as you can imagine, the roofs of these wattle and daub houses were always pitched very steeply to shed rain and snow, and were covered in either thatch or turf. So in either, the byproduct of straw from the wheat fields that they farmed, or, if they lived in a bog or kind of a swampy region, turf was a lot cheaper to use. And on the inside, a hearth was usually placed in the middle of the central space with, as you can imagine, a monitor, a hole cut in the roof to let in light and to vent smoke outwards. And in all of these, especially in the Neolithic era, but going all the way to the late medieval period, they would divide the aisles into bays to serve as stalls for livestock, meaning that, yes, humans and domesticated animals shared these homes. Sometimes the halls would be divided in half vertically, sometimes horizontally, but on one side you would have your cows, your sheep, your pigs, whatever you were farming, and on the other side you would have your family. You would bring the animals in at night to protect them because, as we see in the medieval period where people still lived largely like this, cattle raiding was a massive problem, and so you would have want to protect your cattle while you were unconscious, while you were sleeping, right? And so usually these houses were grouped in clusters of about 5 or 6, each likely, serving an extended family of 20 or 30 members. And, remarkably, this type of longhouse was, as I said, so enduring that it continued to be built among European peasant communities right up until the 14th century. Now, the longhouse wasn't just limited to Europe. Many cultures around the world, including those in Southeast Asia and in North America, also built these large communal structures. So, the Iroquois tribes, for instance, constructed an impressive longhouse that we have archaeological evidence for in 1400 AD near what is now Syracuse, New York. And so this longhouse was actually about 110 meters long, absolutely massive compared to the European ones. And the walls, similarly as the European ones, were made from essentially, kind of a palisade of slender posts woven with bark covering. So just like the European ones, big posts woven with tree branches, this is slender posts woven with bark covering, all the way across the world hundreds of years later. And then to support the vaulted roof, just like the European longhouses, they used these 2 parallel rows of thicker columns down the center. And so this ended up being an enormous structure that could have housed up to 200 people, an entire tribe really, making it a true community hub for the Iroquois. And I just think it's amazing how, such similar architectural ingenuity appeared across different cultures around the world at different times. Humans are bound to think in the same ways in similar climates and environments. So in the Neolithic era, right, most builders used perishable materials like mud, like sticks, timber, animal hides, woven grasses, but wherever stone was available, they'd often use it for just the foundations of their buildings, or maybe sometimes buttressing, and definitely sometimes hearths. Stone required, especially in the Neolithic era, very skilled masons to shape and prepare it. And it had great advantages of, permanence, especially its resistance to fire. So for religious structures, Neolithic societies usually preferred stone because it would last forever, because it was permanent, because it symbolized a sort of spiritual eternal realm. But in some areas, in rare cases with a lot of loose stone, like the Orkney Island coast in northern Scotland, stone was actually the easiest building material to use, right? There weren't a lot of trees, and so around 3000 BC, this small village of Skara was built using stone, consisting of 8 stone houses kind of connected by stone-lined alleys. Building with stone can be, very tricky because each piece needs to fit together well, and, people using stone tools in the Neolithic era, and even copper tools, primitive copper tools, they don't really want to take the time to shape stones. There weren't a lot of, proper stonemasons in the Neolithic era. But at Skara, the local granite kind of naturally broke into these brick-like shapes. It was a very brittle rock, making it easier to build, solid dry walls without mortar. So each house essentially in this kind of village that has been excavated had a single room with these kind of rounded corners, a central hearth, and stone furniture like beds, seats, and shelves. The only really non-stone element was the roof, and it's thought that these were probably made from animal hides kind of stretched over whalebone rafters. These would have been perhaps a community that persisted on whaling, on going out ships and hunting whales and fish and other things from the sea. And then around, we think, 3000 BC, people got creative with a building method called the corbel. It's, this clever, sturdy, and fireproof way to span gaps, usually at the tops of buildings, usually, built as a roof. Basically, Neolithic people would stack stones so each one juts out just a bit over the one below it, meeting in the middle with a capstone on top. This technique is called a corbel arch, and you can see a great sort of cross section of one in the smallest picture on the slide towards the bottom. So as you can imagine, if you stack a series of these arches, you get a corbelled vault, stretched out, say, over a long hallway, right? But rotate these arches around a center point and you've got a corbelled dome. You can actually see this ancient technique still in action being used today if you visit the southern Mediterranean, and especially in southern Italy's Puglia region. The round stone houses here, called trulli, are a perfect example of these old school building methods. So these truly are like a living museum of Neolithic building techniques still standing strong today. Back then, you can imagine Neolithic masons were shaping stones using simple tools like stone axes and obsidian knives to kind of chisel small rocks into these corbelled vaults. It's only with the introduction of metal tools that stonework became, much more precise and defined. So as prehistoric communities settled down, they wanted to understandably remember their dead all over the world. And so all over the prehistoric world, people raised stones and built mounds as markers for the deceased. This need to commemorate the dead led to the earliest designs of monuments intended to last really forever. And so, this high style architecture of the prehistoric world is usually built in stone. Architecture, all about commemorating ancestors or showing off the status of, powerful chieftains, powerful past chieftains. Usually you'll find, these megalithic structures commemorate the dead in some way. So megaliths are kind of a catch-all term for large stones that are dragged across the land and set up markers in some way to remember those who came before. So the earliest megaliths you see here were called menhirs, these tall upright stones marking burial sites. Usually you'll find, a burial directly under this cremated or inhumation, and these stones were, obviously chosen for their very impressive size and usually largely, left in their natural state, not really carved, not really chiseled into any particular shape. But megaliths and menhirs are found worldwide, especially from 4000 to 1000 BC. We can only guess at how they moved these massive stones, probably with ropes, log levers, and earthen ramps. The stones were placed in these very deep foundation holes, so probably kind of tipped over with the aid of ropes and earthen ramps. The next widespread progression of burial commemoration in the prehistoric era, in contrast to the wide open spaces of menhirs, are these kind of closed cave-like spaces or tombs called dolmens. And a lot of times you would have found probably, a very valued chieftain or chiefess buried in one of these as you would use a tomb today. But a dolmen is essentially this simple box-like chamber made up of megaliths and covered with earth, formed by two lateral megaliths supporting a kind of horizontal capstone. And many dolmens we see today are freestanding stone structures, but you have to understand a lot of them have been excavated, but they were originally covered with these earthen mounds, marking kind of a very prominent hill in a flat landscape. And some dolmens, like the Chianca dolmen in southern Italy, had an articulated pathway lined with flat stones leading to it, so kind of innovating on the classic dolmen, classic tomb layout, probably for a particularly revered chieftain. Cairns are kind of the next progression on top of dolmens we see in the prehistoric world, and they're essentially tunnels made of linked dolmens leading to an interior vaulted chamber, usually vaulted with a corbelled dome. And cairns were essentially, an innovation on dolmens that had multiple tombs. So they served as, probably generational tomb sites. Maybe a chieftain and his dynasty were buried in one of these. We usually find mounded cairns appearing throughout Europe, from Spain to Ireland, with, again, these kind of lined passages leading to burial chambers. The cairn at Newgrange, 30 miles north of Dublin, was built around 3000 to 2500 BC. And interestingly, by the 1000s BC, the Celts no longer knew who the mountains were dedicated to, and so they thought it was dedicated to the king of their gods, but it was probably intended for a chieftain and his dynasty. You know, this very impressive mound, the grandest of over 150 of them found in Ireland, is surrounded by these 97 megaliths set on their sides and inscribed with these amazing spirals, chevrons, and grids and other abstract patterns. And then going inside, you enter this cruciform shaped central chamber with these 3 niches, which is accessed again in the usual way by a dolmen lined kind of hallway. So the vaulted ceiling is a corbel dome, and it forms, obviously this kind of domed conical shape. But then at the entrance, you actually have a small window above the entry, allowing sunlight to penetrate during the winter solstice. So during the winter solstice, the sun actually shines directly into this tomb, illuminating it, negating the need for candles or lights. The entire tomb chamber is lit up on the winter solstice, and so this suggests the builders really intended this for more than just a tomb. Possibly they used this to help them with proper farming cycles, or probably other purposes. Around the mound, also a ring of 38 standing megaliths, 12 of them are still upright, are set at regular intervals, and these structures align to different but prominent constellations. So this isn't just a focus on the dead. This tomb doesn't just focus on the dead, it focuses on sacred time to these prehistoric populations, turning the tombs into essentially temples for observing the stars and measuring celestial time. On the Maltese Islands, just south of Sicily, prehistoric communities built some incredible megalithic temples between 3600 and 2500 BC, some of the first megalithic proper temples to survive around the Mediterranean. So here, we're really transitioning from the cairns to, much more complex religious structures. There's 23 temples in all on these islands, all kind of following a similar design, and the Hagar Kim complex, which you see here, is, the prime example, the best surviving example as well. So essentially, these Maltese temple builders, we see this pilgrimage site growing over time in the archaeological record. So, these Maltese designers would start with a pair of rounded apses and added more over time as the site grew in popularity, grew in, pilgrims visiting, and eventually they enclosed these curving spaces with thick walls lined with megaliths, always making sure the entry faced the rising sun. And these temples, weren't just for looks. They served as, it seems, a place for pilgrims seeking good fortune, or a place for pilgrims with physical ailments looking for relief, or a place for, potential mothers longing for increased fertility. Archaeologists have found votive offerings at the site backing up this idea. They found ceramic statues of obese women, possibly, offerings for fertility. They found body parts, possibly offerings for healing. You might donate a leg or an arm or an eye to heal these parts of your bodies. And then they found lots of horns, possibly, offerings for animal vitality, for this pastoral people, for the health of their herds. Walking inside these temples, we can tell the walls were once plastered this very deep, dark, rich red, creating this kind of, mysterious cave-like atmosphere. The roofs were likely corbel vaulted with stone, covered with turf, but as time went on, you can imagine these very easy, loose stones were taken away for other construction projects in antiquity. And then the most interesting thing, I think, about these temple complexes is you have what archaeologists have called oracle chambers, nestled kind of between the inner apses and exterior walls, and they kind of hint at some kind of hierarchical priesthood, someone that it's thought, hid within the walls of the temple and communicated with the pilgrims in some way. Because these quote-unquote oracle chambers were actually accessed by secret doors, and these chambers would have allowed the oracle essentially to speak through these tiny square slits cut through the megalithic panels into the major temple spaces, the major apses that it's thought the pilgrims would congregate in. Perhaps, they were posing as spirits. Perhaps people knew them as priests, but they couldn't be seen. But there was clearly, some communication between pilgrims coming to the site and whatever was hiding behind the walls. And then also, you would have some of the first altars found in Europe that were very intricately sculpted, and you frequently find on these altars statues of obese women, suggesting the continuation of this kind of mother goddess cult that we saw all the way back in the painted caves. And the most grotesque part about these temples is it's very clear that people made sacrifices of animals and possibly even humans in these temples by pouring libations of blood into holes in the paving stones. So underneath these temples were cisterns holding, we can tell, mass amounts of blood. So collecting, the life force of the offerings sacrificed here within these temples. So these temples provided a religion, a comfort, and a sense of community to the islanders, to the Maltese islanders, until around 2500 BC, when it's very clear that some outside invaders overran the islands of Malta, leaving the temples to fall into ruins. So, the unique, curving, sensuous style of Maltese temple architecture after this point absolutely disappeared from religious buildings of later cultures in this region. And this is, after this point when we begin to see the very square orthogonal temples, typically worshiping male gods. So whoever these invaders were did not worship the mother goddess cult like the Maltese islanders. Now, of course, we can't finish up a lecture about prehistoric architecture without going over Stonehenge. So Stonehenge is the most famous prehistoric monument in Europe, as I'm sure you know, but it may actually kind of be more of a Bronze Age project, mostly due to its transformations, its significant transformations after 2000 BC. But it's neither the largest nor the oldest of the 46 stone circles in Britain, but it attracted the masses of pilgrims in its time. Located on Salisbury Plain in southern England, Stonehenge underwent at least 5 major construction phases over 2,000 years, and it seems to have served a lot of purposes by different invading or replacing people to solar observations, to burial sites. These kind of seem to be the main two. It aligns with the summer and winter solstices. It aligns with perhaps different constellations. It's still kind of being studied. But around 3000 BC, the first generation built just the outer bank and ditch. So no stones yet, likely kind of using a compass made from oxhide rope. They dug the ditch through solid chalk with picks made from antlers and shovels from ox shoulder bones. And then about 500 years later, a new team added a ring of timber poles, which was very common at this time. Not so much megaliths, but timber poles standing in for megaliths around the earthwork, likely connected with beams on the top. And you can see, depictions of these on the slide. I'm starting in 2500 BC, so, the top right-hand picture. And then, in this same iteration, a rectangular wooden structure inside the ring served as, we think, kind of like a mortuary, with the heel stone of bent megalith orienting the site to the moon. And then around 2200 BC, new builders replaced the timber columns with a nearly perfect circle of very rare blue stone megaliths arranged in kind of radiating pairs with a marked entrance aligned to the moon heel stone. These are the stones, the famous stones they transported all the way from Wales, 125 miles away, and they're 4 tons each, so it remains a mystery how they got these stones all the way to Stonehenge. But then a fourth construction phase around 2000 BC replaced these blue stones with 30 sandstone piers, or they're called, archaeologists call them saracens. from aviary, and these are 4-meter tall stones weighing up to 45 tons, which were shaped deliberately into tapering uprights with knobs at the top to fit grooves in the horizontal lintels, forming this kind of continuous ring. And then inside the Sarsen circle, 5 pairs of taller megaliths with lintels called trilithons were arranged in a kind of U shape aligned with the heel stone. And then finally, in the last phase around 1600 BC, the builders reintroduced the bluestones into the design, adding a ring inside the trilithons and another outside the Sarsens. And so that's going to be it for today, guys. This is really just kind of a wide survey of the common forms of architecture you're going to see in the prehistoric world. But we're going to start at human history proper in the next class with Mesopotamia, Old Kingdom Egypt, and the Indus Valley. And, you know, time is going to seem a little bit more linear, a little bit more, you know, of a story with these lectures. So do look forward to that, and I'll see you in the next class.